Is capitalism destroying itself and the wealth of the planet with it?
I think that's total hogwash. Capitalism doesn't destroy wealth, capitalism creates wealth.
Today, Karl Marx and the idea of communism are back in vogue. The original revolutionary socialist has become a cultural icon.
Marx' Kapitalband 1 auf die Bühne zu bringen, ist eine völlig verrückte Idee.
Der Erfolg dieses Stücks ist sehr erstaunlich. Für mich völlig unerwartet.
Der Reichtum der Gesellschaften, in welchen kapitalistische Produktionsweise herrscht, erscheint als eine ungeheure Warensammlung.
Marx, il peut nous donner beaucoup d'aide.
But can Marx's critique of capitalism really help us through our crisis-ridden times?
The question for Marx, which might be slightly different for us now, is what comes after that critique.
What might we learn from a thinker whose ideas were supposed to have disappeared with the fall of the Berlin Wall, more than 20 years ago?
Was endgültig ausgespielt hat, ist natürlich die Idee einer revolutionären Diktatur des Proletariats.
Have we been living in a dream? Is the capitalist world about to be unmasked as an ideological illusion and replaced by the communist system we thought had gone for good?
At last, Comrade Marx. Have we met? Let's just say we are theoretically acquainted. Do you believe in destiny, comrade?
No.
Why not?
Because the emancipation of the proletariat requires the critique of bourgeois ideology.
Oh, I know exactly what you mean. Do you want to know the truth, comrade? You're slave to a liberal ideology that goes deeper than you can possibly imagine. Ideology is everywhere. When you read Shakespeare, when you pay for your daughter's acting classes, when you buy your hemorrhoid cream. No one can be told what an ideology is, Karl. You must see it, not to believe it. Take the blue pill, and you'll wake up in Cologne as the editor of a provincial newspaper and join a Masonic lodge. Take the red pill, and I will show you how far the permanent revolution goes.
It's a nightmare they don't want to revisit, the Asian economic crisis.
Marx devoted his life to studying capitalism and its crises. But how did today's economists explain the most damaging economic event since the Great Depression of the 1930s? Norbert Walter is the former chief economist at Deutsche Bank.
Ich bin davon überzeugt, dass wir komplexe Fehler gemacht haben und die Fehler nicht nur makroökonomische sind. In Amerika konnte man 110% des Verkehrswertes eines Hauses beleihen. Und damit konnte man nicht nur jedes Haus kaufen, sondern man konnte zusätzlich auch noch seine Möbel kaufen und einen Urlaub machen und ein schönes Auto. Und dies hat zu der jetzigen dramatischen Verschlechterung der Situation geführt.
In London, the financial centre of Europe, the crisis has also raised questions about the future of the free market. Eamon Butler is the head of the Adam Smith Institute. Butler blames the crisis not on too little financial regulation, but on too much.
One of the foundations of the modern economy is money. And unfortunately, money is a monopoly of the government. And so what they tend to do is to debauch the currency. They overinflate the currency. They keep interest rates artificially low, which the market would not do. We go out and we get loans and we buy houses, and then we feel and the houses go up in value, and then we feel even richer, and then we go out and buy more things. It's just like being on a drug. You know, you have a drug and it gives you an instant high, and you say, hey, this is great. But then it starts to wear off. So you take a bit more. And then that wears off. So you need an even bigger dose next time. And that's what governments have done to our economy, unfortunately, and that's why we are in a big mess, and I really hope that they don't do the same thing again.
My administration is working with Congress to address the root cause behind much of the instability in our markets.
Bush pouvait faire sa politique néolibérale et sa politique de guerre seulement si la classe ouvrière et en général tous les travailleurs américains étaient tranquilles. Et pour le faire tranquille, il fallait leur permettre de s'acheter la maison, de maintenir un certain niveau de consommation. Donc la crise, c'est quoi? C'est le fait que le système néolibéral n'arrive pas à donner aux gens le prix de leur travail.
Ich glaube, dass das eine denkbare Hypothese ist, die ich allerdings für zu konspirativ und für zu einseitig halte. Wir haben ganz sicherlich auch Schuld der Zentralbanken, die den New Economy Bust der Jahre 2001, 2002 ausgleichen wollten mit billigem Geld. Auch diese haben dazu geführt, dass sehr viele Menschen solche Assets erworben haben und dann hinterher in die Krise geraten sind.
What was Karl Marx's approach to thinking the economic system we call capitalism? How do his ideas help us understand a system which has come to dominate so many aspects of our lives?
As a thinker, I would characterize Marx principally as a brilliant theorist of capitalism. But as well as being a theorist of capitalism, he was also the leader of a political movement and what I would call a utopian theorist. What I mean is that he believed he'd discovered a kind of logic in history, a kind of logic of human development, a logic of the development of the entire species, whose built-in endpoint, although it might not be achieved, was a condition of universal freedom.
There's a beautiful phrase or expression by Ernst Bloch writing about Marx, where he says, well, Marx is often accused for having this uncompromising, brutalizing, kind of impersonal thinking. And Bloch says, well, this is a result of Marx having to think like capitalism. So he says, just like the best detective has to think like a criminal, the best detective has to enter into the mentality of the criminal, which is a very dangerous practice. And of course, many Marxists who have tried to think like capitalism have effectively become apologists of capitalism, and that might be the reason why. But that, in a sense, is, I think, a great way of understanding Marx's method and the energy and combativeness of his thought. What does it mean for a detective to think like a criminal?
A spectre is haunting Europe, the spectre of communism. All the powers of old Europe have entered into a holy alliance to exorcise this spectre. Pope and Tsar, Metternich and Giesel, French radicals and German police spies.
The Communist Manifesto is Marx's most famous political work. It seems light years away from our modern liberal concerns.
The Communist Manifesto has always had really interestingly delayed effects in history. It's not a book, even though it's written with this tone of urgency because it's a manifesto, it's this kind of, breathless text in a way. Nevertheless, the kind of real effects of that weren't sort of seen for kind of, 50 or so years later. And I think, it goes through various reiterations, reappears and its relevance and different parts of it are stressed at different times.
What is capitalism? Capitalism is an economic system driven by the profit motive. According to Marx, capitalism thrives on the exploitation of the working class. In order to make a profit, the capitalist pays his workers less than the true value of their labor time. For Marx, such exploitation was the main cause of social conflict, or class struggle, between capitalists determined to increase their profits and workers struggling to earn a living.
Bottom level, there really are only two classes and one of them exploits the other.
But do Marxist theories of exploitation and class struggle still hold true today? Or is the way in which capitalists make their profits changing? Slavoj Žižek is a Slovenian philosopher at the forefront of a popular revival in Marxist and communist thinking.
It's obvious, and Marx already had an idea vague of it, that with knowledge emerging as a central factor of wealth production, this classical logic of exploitation no longer works. Vulgar example, Bill Gates owns what Marx calls part of our general intellect, the substance, our symbolic substance, means of communication, and it's as if in order for us to communicate among ourselves, we have to pay him a rent. So, and also this, I think, changes the very definition of what is proletariat today. Proletarian position is no longer just the working class. It's no longer typical, even to be a little bit cynical today. It's almost as if most of the protests today, protests of the unemployed and so on, are ironically sustained by a demand, please provide us a job where we can be at least in a normal way exploited.
For many thinkers, the question of exploitation remains as important today as it was in Marx's time. But capitalism has evolved and modes of work have changed in ways which Marx himself was unable to predict, according to Italian political philosopher Antonio Negri.
Le problème, le pire qu'on puisse faire aujourd'hui, c'est d'oublier que la valeur, c'est-à-dire l'exploitation du travail, de la force travail, n'est plus seulement l'exploitation du travailleur de l'usine, mais c'est l'exploitation du travailleur de la société. Et qu'aujourd'hui, la production des cerveaux, l'invention, la recherche, le cinéma produisent plus de valeur que celui qui est produit dans les usines traditionnelles. Et aujourd'hui, le retour de Marx est sur ça. Chez nous, on veut faire la révolution à partir des usines. Au revoir. On ne la verra jamais. On doit partir de l'usine et de tous les autres travailleurs. Parce que ce sont les autres travailleurs qui sont les plus exploités.
Ich denke, dass wenn man die moderne Welt, unsere gegenwärtige Welt mit dem Begriff der Ausbeutung angeht, dass dann nicht das erste Augenmerk auf die Dienstleistungsgesellschaften des Westens oder hochindustrialisierten Nordens zu fallen hat, sondern eher auf die Ausbeutungsverhältnisse in dem, was man klassisch die dritte Welt hält. Von daher finde ich es mit Verlaub obszön, Ausbeutung vor allen Dingen hier festzumachen und nicht den Blick zu werfen auf Produktionsstätten, in denen Menschen 12 Stunden und mehr unter miserablen Arbeitsbedingungen für minimale Löhne arbeiten müssen.
Herfried Münkler is the co-editor of Marx and Engels' complete works. He teaches politics at the Humboldt University of Berlin. Along with Antonio Negri, Michael Hart is the co-author of best-selling books on globalization. Like Negri, Hart sees knowledge, information and natural resources as the common wealth of all peoples.
I think instead what has happened is capitalist economy has developed towards centering on precisely the production of many immaterial and in some ways immeasurable goods. It's no longer centered on the production of countable automobiles and refrigerators and toasters, but rather centered on the production of ideas, the production of social relationships through services, a variety of, they're not unreal, but often intangible assets.
The theorist Alberto Toscano is more orthodox when it comes to thinking the relation of work and exploitation under capitalism.
People in a call center might be engaging in activity which we could refer to as cognitive or immaterial, but they are also, and in fact most importantly, working in an environment which is organized in terms of very classical forms of labor despotism, of very classical forms of how to extract, every second or millisecond, how to scientifically manage work in such a way that it can be more productive and in such a way that the rate of exploitation, as Mark would put it, is intensified. Though I think, Hart and Negri are entirely right to identify certain tendencies, I don't think that immaterial labor, for instance, is the source, will be the source as such of, future emancipatory politics.
Jacques Rancière is a renowned thinker of working-class politics. For Rancière, economic exploitation is not the dominant factor in all social struggle.
Mais on peut avoir des sociétés avec des écarts absolument monstrueux entre les riches et les pauvres, et la plupart des sociétés ont été marquées par de tels écarts, sans que cela ait par soi-même, disons, des conséquences explosives ou des conséquences révolutionnaires. C'est simplement ça que je dis, c'est-à-dire qu'on ne peut pas tirer simplement de la logique de l'exploitation l'idée d'une logique de la fin de l'exploitation.
For Marx, class struggle was part of everyday life. But the theory of exploitation was not Marx's sole contribution to understanding capitalism. In order to grasp capitalism's true power and persuasive hold over us, we must delve into the strange and mystical world of the commodity.
It is clear as noonday that man, by his industry, changes the forms of the materials furnished by nature, in such a way as to make them useful to him. The form of wood, for instance, is altered by making a table out of it, and yet the table continues to be that common, everyday thing, wood. But so soon as it steps forth as a commodity, it is changed into something transcendent.
Capital, Marx's landmark study of political economy, begins with a chapter devoted to commodities and the fetishism of commodities. Today, we're used to hearing about sexual fetishes, but for Marx, the commodity fetish was something quite different. Norbert Bolz is a leading media theorist and the author of the Consumerist Manifesto.
Ich selber halte die Theorie des Warenfetischs für die wichtigste Entdeckung von Marx und ironischerweise haben die meisten Freunde von Marx ja auch nur diese Kapitel gelesen, weil sie am Anfang des berühmten Buches Das Kapital stehen. Vielleicht sind sie aber auch tatsächlich die wertvollsten, weil sie ein Geheimnis enthüllen, das bis zum heutigen Tag eigentlich verständlich macht, warum der Kapitalismus so gut funktioniert. Und das ist das Geheimnis, dass Waren auf den kapitalistischen Märkten nicht einfach nur Bedürfnisse befriedigen, sondern dass sie eine Art spirituellen Mehrwert transportieren und dass dieser spirituelle Mehrwert der eigentliche Grund des Kaufs ist.
Peter Sloterdijk also sees ongoing relevance in Marx's theory of commodity fetishism in our modern consumer way of life.
Also die Theorie vom wahren Fetischismus oder überhaupt vom Fetischismus als solchem ist vermutlich der unsterbliche Teil in der Marxischen Doktrin, aus einem einfachen Grund, weil Marx zu den Entdeckern der Tatsache gehört, dass die Dinge leben.
Die Textilindustrie ist einer der ältesten und nach Zahl der Beschäftigten und Umsatz einer der wichtigsten Wirtschaftszweige des produzierenden Gewerbes. Ein Rock ist einröhrig und umschließt von der Hüfte an abwärts beide Beine gleichzeitig, während die Hose für jedes Bein extra eine Röhre bildet. Anhand verschiedener anatomischer Untersuchungen von altsteinzeitlichen Fuß- und Beinskeletten entstand die Theorie, dass Menschen bereits vor 40.000 Jahren Schuhe kannten. Handtaschen waren im Mittelalter ein aus Leder am Gürtel befestigtes Accessoire für Männer. Später wechselte das modische Nutzobjekt zum weiblichen Utensil. Als Taschen mit Tragegriff viele Stoffe kommen aus den Niedrigpreisländern, unter anderem der Volksrepublik China, Indien, Südkorea und Taiwan.
The theory of commodity fetishism describes how we accept value as a natural quality of things. But according to Marx, such belief is an illusion. Every commodity, like every value, must be produced. Even something as seemingly natural as water is commodified, purified, packaged, and transported to the customer, a process from which the capitalist duly extracts a profit.
Value is in the eye of the beholder. Value doesn't exist in objects.
What I would say is that commodity fetishism is only the capitalist version of a type of objectification which is humanly universal.
Is this the real world? Or are we the victims of a marketplace that seduces us, mystifying our senses with its fantasy objects? For Marx, commodities exist not to satisfy our needs, nor because they are really useful to us, but simply to be bought and sold.
Fetishism is an illusion which is part of reality itself. You have this wonderful double reversal that things are the way they are. You may be conscious how things really are, but in your practice you follow an illusion of which you are not conscious.
Well, I think our tendency to overinvest importance in particular objects is a matter of human psychology rather than of economics. It's the way we are, and we follow fashion, for example. So we look and see what are the great celebrities wearing or eating or driving, and we want one of those, and that's human nature. The economic system is morally neutral on this subject. It simply produces what people want.
How does commodity fetishism apply to the new social networks of the information age? Is it possible that the commodity extends from what we buy to the very core of who we are?
The modern media, so to speak, colonize, partly create and partly colonize, partly mobilize collective fantasies. I think that sort of transcends anything which you find in Marx, because the technology and the level of development wasn't such that it permitted that kind of insight at that time.
Today, the commodity or consumer way of life is everywhere and in everything we do. We see the world through commodity eyes, so that every social encounter becomes a potential sale, not just of material possessions, but of our individual selves.
Der Grundgedanke von Marx, dass die Waren Fetische sind, wurde im 20. Jahrhundert aufgenommen, besonders bei den Denkern der Frankfurter Schule. Und da ist es wiederum Walter Benjamin, der den interessantesten Beitrag zur Modernisierung des Fetischismus geleistet hat, denn er entdeckt die strukturelle Ähnlichkeit zwischen der menschlichen Ware und der sachlichen Ware. Kurzum, Walter Benjamin universalisiert die Kategorie der Prostitution. Und Prostitution liegt immer dann vor, wenn ein schönes Ding Leben vortäuscht und den Passanten mit einem Angebot verführen möchte.
The whole mystery of commodities, all the magic and necromancy that surrounds the products of labour, as long as they take the form of commodities, vanishes therefore, so soon as we come to other forms of production.
For Marx, the expectation was that the commodity would eventually give way to other forms of economic production and cooperation, in which value is no longer measured purely in monetary terms. Can we imagine a world without commodities?
Vielleicht kann man sich eine Welt ohne Waren und ohne die Warenform vorstellen, aber ich denke, kaum jemand wird sie sich wünschen. Denn eine Welt ohne Waren würde bedeuten, eine Welt ohne das universale Medium Geld. Denn die Universalisierung des Geldes verwandelt alles, was uns umgibt, in Waren, im Grunde potenziell zumindest. Und wir haben, denke ich, doch in den letzten Jahrzehnten gemerkt, dass Geld ein Medium ist, das unabdingbar ist für Zivilisation, auch wenn Sie so wollen, für friedliches Zusammenleben der Menschen, für die Organisation komplexer Gesellschaften.
People are trying to think about, different ways of living sustainably, to try and create these kind of like homeostatic modes of existence where there is no waste, and maybe even live in a kind of collective way, or hint at a communal way of living. And I think people do feel a real kind of need sometimes, or a desire for that sort of, let's say, a simpler but kind of more creative and more interesting life, to have proper relations with people that aren't mediated through this kind of, commodity fetishism.
Today, there is growing disquiet in Western societies on a range of social, economic and environmental questions. A new generation of Marx-inspired thinkers sees ecology as a decisive political issue.
The management of the ecological common, of the air, the earth, the atmosphere, by private property and even by states has led us to the brink of disaster. But similarly, I think in economic terms, we're ever more handicapped in our, even in economic functioning, by the rule of private property and even the mechanisms of accumulation through profit.
Communism in the sense of we are dealing with a commons. Our earth as natural substance, somehow we have to manage it together.
If you look at the common in communism, it gives you a very different view than we've inherited from either from Soviet ideology or from US anti-communist ideology.
Can Marx's work present a green alternative to the management of our planet's natural resources?
Also das Interessante an der Marxischen Theorie ist, dass den Ausbeutungsbegriff irgendwann nicht mehr nur auf die menschliche Arbeitskraft, sondern auch auf die begrenzten Ressourcen der Natur angewandt hat. Dass also, wenn die Ausbeutung der Natur weitergeht, das auch eine Dimension von Naturzerstörung ist. Ich glaube nur, sozusagen der Gedanke des gemeinsamen Eigentums der Erde als Erde bedarf nicht zwingend einer kommunistischen Produktionsweise, in der jede Form des Eigentums abgeschafft ist, sondern es ist auch möglich, sich über die Grenzen der Ausbeutung der Natur unter den Bedingungen von Privateigentum zu verständigen.
John Gray believes that global capitalism develops in ways that are not only difficult to predict, but also impossible to control.
Where the neo-Leninists, but also the Greens, are correct is in arguing that human action has destabilized the planetary environment. Where they are deluded is in believing that human action can restabilize the planetary environment. What, from the fact that humans have triggered this instability, it does not follow that humans can stop it, even if humans were capable of acting as a global collective, which they are not and will not be.
An under-regulated banking sector is often regarded as having been responsible for the economic crisis which began in 2007. But is state regulation of the economy the only solution? Which examples from history might help us avoid ever greater catastrophes in future?
It was a very interesting time in the 19th century in the United States, where in Boston there was a bank called the Suffolk Bank, and at that time banks would produce their own currencies, and the Suffolk Bank would take the currency of any bank and it would give you hard currency, hard cash back. It would take the notes in and it would give you coins out. If it didn't trust a particular bank, if it thought a particular bank was perhaps taking too many risks, it might only give you 95 cents on the dollar. Now that's a brilliant system, because what it means is that banks become very aware of the risks that they're taking.
That's a kind of utopian pathology of deluded thinking on the right, which is recurrent because what it refuses to confront are the inherent contradictions which emerge in rapidly developing capitalist economies. The reason we are where we are now and have the type of large banking systems and so forth that we do have is that at every point in its history, capitalism has been intertwined with state power.
Last year we found $17 billion in cuts. This year we've already found $20 billion.
What power or incentive do governments have to reform capitalism?
Also in der Marxischen Vorstellung ist Krise ein Indikator des bevorstehenden Untergangs und Endes. Aber es ist nun interessant, dass der Kapitalismus ja seit der Veröffentlichung von Marxens Schriften eine Reihe von Krisen durchgemacht hat und danach eben nicht untergegangen ist, sondern man möchte fast meinen, sich verjüngt hat. Und genau das hat Josef Schumpeter in dem Begriff der Krise als kreative Zerstörung zu fassen versucht. Der Kapitalismus altert nicht, weil die Krisen für ihn gleichsam einen Jungbrunnen darstellen.
The kind of capitalism that has entered into crisis is a capitalism that is producing ever more of what Marx called superfluous populations, or surplus populations. What Mike Davis in The Planet of Slums has called a kind of surplus humanity. That is to say, it's not entirely clear that capitalism as it exists today needs people, needs workers in the same way that it needed before.
Capital functions through crises. So crisis doesn't mean the demise of capital. Capital functions by breaking down. It's a paradoxical way of working, but that's the way it works. And often what happens, this is of course one of the things that's happening as a result of the 2008 economic and financial crisis, is that crisis allows the possibility for new concentrations of capital, sometimes through privatization, sometimes simply through the concentration of wealth or power in fewer hands.
There's a way in which kind of capitalism is undead. You know, it keeps going even though, you know, no one has any faith in it anymore. No one believes in it. You know, and you know, this idea of a kind of free market was always a joke, but is even more of a joke now. I mean, you know, the level of state intervention, you know, we're seeing the way in which this kind of plays out badly for the losers. I mean, look at what's happening in Greece at the moment.
Notre problème, ce sont plutôt les messieurs du FMI, ce sont de la Banque mondiale et en général de Goldman Sachs et de tous ceux qui ont été aidés par les gouvernements à maintenir le pouvoir.
If the state and the economy are so closely intertwined, and if capitalism needs crisis to function, then what sense is there in believing that another world is possible? Is there any way out of our crisis-ridden times?
Le capital est toujours quelque chose dans lequel nous, on est. On est dedans. Il n'y a pas en dehors du capital. On est dans le capital et on doit lutter contre lui. Exactement de la même façon que les patrons luttent contre nous.
Today, capitalism's flaws are leading people to consider political alternatives, of which communism is one. But given the communist disasters of the 20th century, how can we really take the idea of communism seriously?
But the trickiest mode of the false fidelity to the 20th century communism is, I think, the rejection of all really existing socialisms on behalf of some authentic working class movement just around the corner waiting to explode.
Ich denke, es geht darum, ja, wie gesagt, Alternativen zu denken, aber nicht in den alten staatlichen Formen.
Ich glaube, dass also der Kapitalismus steht ja im Moment nur so da, weil die Alternative fehlt.
20th century, not only in its totalitarian aspect, communism as we knew it, but that's important to add. Now I will get less and less popular. Everyone would agree with this. Then I add to it also social democratic welfare state. But not only social democracy, even, that's my nastiest thesis, even the darling of the radical democratic left, this idea against the ossified state structures, spontaneous local self-organization, direct democracy, councils, and so on, even that should be written off.
Micha Brumlik is a critic of the new Marxist thinking. For Brumlik, the prospect of creating an alternative to capitalism which neglects democracy is highly problematic.
Wir müssen der Idee des Kommunismus wieder etwas abgewinnen, ohne dass diese Leute in der Lage wären zu sagen, wie dieser Kommunismus dann tatsächlich politisch organisiert sein soll. Und ich finde, nach den Erfahrungen des 20. Jahrhunderts hat man ein Recht darauf zu wissen, wie es denn am Ende aussehen soll, was die politischen, die konkreten Vorschläge und Visionen sind.
How practical is the idea of communism? Does it offer a political alternative to the state socialisms of the past? Or is it a philosophical debate?
I do think it's important to struggle over the term, because the terms have such a history of hope and suffering that are attached to them. What's meant by communism in common language? It's meant the exact opposite of what I mean by it. It's meant absolute state control of the economy and society, which seems to be counter to everything Marx said about it too.
Was wir brauchen, ist eine aufgeweckte und kritische Zivilgesellschaft, die die politischen Parteien im System der repräsentativen Demokratie nicht alleine lässt, sondern sie aus dem Raum der Gesellschaft heraus unter Druck setzt. Negri und Hart haben das, wie ich glaube, begriffen. Sie haben keine Theorie dazu, wie ihr revolutionäres Subjekt, diese sehr unklare Multitude, die Multitude, sich jemals nochmals zu einer politischen Körperschaft zusammenschließen wird.
Marx imagined communism as a classless society. For Jacques Rancière, the political challenge today is one of creating an emancipated society in which everyone has an equal share.
C'est ça que j'ai trouvé important dans l'idée d'émancipation, c'est l'idée d'une sorte de, disons, d'action qui est toujours au présent, quoi. La logique marxiste est une logique qui est fondée, effectivement, fondamentalement sur la préparation d'un futur, quoi. Alors que, bon, je crois que l'idée d'émancipation est vraiment liée à une sorte d'apparition déjà maintenant, si vous voulez, de ceux qu'on appelle des sans-parts, de ceux qui sont sans-parts et qui, bon, s'imposent comme des acteurs sur la scène publique, comme capables aussi bien de penser que d'intervenir politiquement, que aussi de prouver leur capacité à organiser la production.
Ce qu'on a dit qui est le communisme en Russie n'a jamais été le communisme. C'était le socialisme et même les Russes soviétiques ont toujours dit on est dans le socialisme. Et le socialisme, c'est une forme de gestion du capital. Exactement comme le libéralisme est une forme de gestion du capital.
Bon, certains penseurs, effectivement, essayent de maintenir... comme Tony Negri, l'idée que le capitalisme produit du communisme. Mais bon, je pense qu'en réalité, le capitalisme produit une certaine forme de communisme. Oui, un communisme à lui, quoi. Mais qui n'est pas du tout le communisme, pour moi, de la capacité de tous, quoi. Et puis, il y a ceux qui disent, bon, voyez le capitalisme, donc, après tout, le communisme, c'est pas si mal comme idée, quoi. Mais je ne pense pas que ceux-là, disons, construisent véritablement la pensée, en quelque sorte, de l'égalité, d'une égalité sensible aujourd'hui.
Le communisme est quelque chose qui vient se construire, non, dans un rapport entre les modifications du réel et la volonté, la décision de faire ça, de construire ça.
a communist society would be a society where everyone would be allowed to dwell in his or her own stupidity. You know who gave me this idea? Even Fred Jameson, who said, what if you imagine communism not as a perfectly normal society, but like a crazy society that you find like in some Bruegel's painting, Proverbs. You know, a madman here, there is a man who thinks he is a chicken and Gaga walks like this. There is a man who thinks he is Napoleon walks. You know, all these madmen politely exist. Wouldn't this be nice?
Is the idea of communism a fantasy? Is communism only realizable in our imagination?
It can't be some kind of utopian fantasy about what comes after the apocalypse. You know, people are thinking all the time about this kind of the end of the world, and this kind of, you know, somehow it's supposed to be easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism.
The end point is knowledge. Things are getting so rational because, you know, there is the paradox of knowledge. Everybody knows, or of intellectual properties, that with ordinary material property, we have a competition, because if we have here a nice steak, if I eat it, then you don't eat it. No, you know what I mean? Like, through use, it gets used. With knowledge, it's the opposite. If I know something and tell it to you, knowledge not only doesn't get used in the sense of less functional, true, but it even gets rich. Knowledge as commodity is effectively an anti-capitalist commodity.
There's no proletarian movement. There are no mass communist parties. The left is in pretty well universal disarray. There is no agency. There is no historical agency. I mean, this is entirely the neo-Bolshevik and neo-Leninist movement. This is entirely a creation of the media, of cultural criticism, of hermetic seminars, of cabaret-like performances. It does not exist in any form of practical politics anywhere in the world and will not.
Menschen müssen sich miteinander verbünden, Allianzen gegen das Tödliche zu schmieden. Das heißt, sie müssen sich gegenseitig Sicherheit geben, sie müssen sich gegenseitig Solidargemeinschaften anbieten. Heute in einem planetarischen Ausmaß, weil wir zum ersten Mal in der Situation leben, dass so etwas wie kollektive Selbstzerstörung möglich ist. Also wir müssen erstmal, bevor wir Kommunismus sagen, müssen wir das Prinzip Immunismus verstanden haben. Das heißt, wir müssen das Prinzip der gegenseitigen Versicherung als das tiefste Solidaritätsmotiv verstanden haben.
Today, perhaps the attraction of Marx's ideas can be explained by our desire for clear alternatives in a world where few exist. A simple choice between a blue or a red pill. The blue pill for the cozy retreat into our consumer fantasies. Or the red pill, which finally reveals the truth.
I'm not sure I do think this is very helpful at all. I think, you know, the only way to really understand the world is to be kind of continually curious and skeptical and cynical about it perhaps, but always perhaps with a sort of underlying optimism that things can get better and that you yourself can contribute to making the world a better place.
In my world, it's the blue pill, which is the reality, of course. Red.
My ultimate position, maybe I changed my position, I know, would have been, no, there must be a third pill.
Ich würde immer die rote Pille nehmen und ich würde allen, die ich liebe, dasselbe empfehlen.
I want the third pill, but of course, when you take the third pill, you see that this is the true second pill.
Anyway, I would go along with him. If he wants the third pill, I want the third pill too.
There are no pills. No pills can stabilize any of these constructions. All these constructions are highly fragile.
Es ist keine Frage der Wahl. So, wir haben die Wahl schon lange hinter uns und wir sind bereits durch beide Pillen vergiftet.
C'est le moment, non? Pas de lire le vieux manifeste de Marx, mais d'en écrire un autre.